Thank you very much, everybody, for joining in this evening. So just to introduce myself, I'm the Senior Advisor for Science and Exploration at the European Space Agency. Of course, we operate telescopes in space as well as all sorts of other missions. And in fact, these are images taken by the Hubble Space Telescope, which Andy showed a little bit earlier. And we have Meredith Rawls from the University of Washington, who's involved in the Vera Rubin Observatory, which is a new, very wide field survey telescope, which can be looking across a lot of the sky from one location very rapidly, taking lots of images in great detail. We have Sam Lawler from the University of Regina in Canada, and she works on disks and Kuiper belt objects and how we can understand our planetary system in the context of exoplanet systems. And Michelle Kramer, who is director at the Max Planck Institute for Radio Astronomy in Bonn, involved in pulsars, but also in new big projects, so LOFAR and SKA. Let me start with an opening question then, Meredith. And Andy sort of partly addressed this, but keeping in mind the general audience, aren't there just loads of satellites in space already? You know, couldn't we have anticipated this problem? We've had telescopes on the ground for a long time. Why is this a big problem all of a sudden? It's partly the satellites, I think, but also what we're planning for new facilities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you're right that there have been satellites, launched into space since the 50s now at this point. But the change that's happening in the last couple of years has been a huge increase in the number of satellites being launched and the number of satellites that are planned to be launched. And everybody, including the satellite operators themselves, have been surprised to see how bright these satellites are. They can be illuminated well after sunset because the sun is still reflecting off of the satellite body or the solar panels of the satellite. And so they can be very bright to ground-based observers, even in the nighttime.
Okay, and specifically, you're working on a project which is, let's call it, more vulnerable than others, but it's not the only project of its kind around. So why explicitly, as we're building these big new telescopes, is this sort of even a double issue?
Yeah, so I primarily work for Rubin Observatory, which is this wonderful 6.5-meter telescope under construction in Chile. It's going to survey the whole night sky, like you were saying, in full color. It's going to help us find really deep, faint sources, really interesting moving variable sources. But all of the really cool ways that we're designing Rubin Observatory to be able to find these amazing new phenomena is also the exact same characteristics that make it really vulnerable to large numbers of bright low Earth orbit satellites. And that's simply because it has a really wide field of view. So you're more likely to get a satellite streak across any given image that you take. And it also has a large mirror, makes it very sensitive to things that are even relatively faint.
Great. So Sam, let's talk a little bit about the specifics of the kinds of things we're looking for in astronomy today. Are all observations affected equally? I mean, on one hand, we can take very deep field images and kind of stack the images and get rid of satellite trails, but other sorts of projects really can't do that. So talk us through some of the projects which are even more vulnerable.
So in my area of astronomy, so I try to find Kuiper belt objects in the distant solar system, right? So these are very, very faint. I'm using wide field imaging. So the Vera Rubin Observatory will be awesome for this kind of astronomy. And so I need to stare at a spot on the sky for a few minutes to gather enough light to see these really faint objects. And during that time, many satellites could fly through the field of view that are millions of times brighter than the very faint objects that I'm trying to find. So yeah, wide field astronomy will be the most strongly affected. There are different types of astronomy that will not be as strongly affected, but could have really big consequences if a satellite does fly through. So trying to find exoplanets right next to a star, you have a very small field of view, but your instrument is incredibly sensitive. So the odds of a satellite flying through are small, but if it does, it could really damage your instrument, right? So there's a couple of examples for you.
I mean, I was also thinking about near-Earth asteroids and observing at twilight, because these satellites are visible at twilight predominantly, and that affects certain observations really a lot, right? Because that's the prime time for looking for things.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, near-Earth objects are most easily found close to twilight. which is when satellites are the brightest and are going to cause the most confusion, right? And finding near-Earth objects is, I would argue, the most directly important part of astronomy, right? Like protecting our planet from something that could potentially kill everything on the planet, right? So this is not an area of astronomy we want to mess with. It's important.
Michelle, let's bring you in. So we've talked about the visible impact, the fact that human beings can see these satellites fly across the sky and our very sensitive optical infrared telescopes, but it's a big problem for radio astronomers as well. And so talk us through why that is. I mean, I can't see in the radio, you know, who cares, right? And there are protected frequency bands. Why don't astronomers just stick to those and let the telecoms operators do what they want to do? But it's just not that simple, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, the problem with radio astronomers is it's not just a streak in your data. If you have a satellite signal in your data, it's basically blinding the whole telescope, and you cannot just edit it, the data. So the problem is, of course, we have developed along with radio technology, and yes, a lot of the there are some bands protected, and we have learned to share part of the spectrum. But the protected spectrum is only about 1% of the frequencies that we really want to look at. And a satellite is 1 billion times stronger than a normal radio source we try to look at today, and not even speaking about the next generation of telescopes like the SKA. So we have tried to build the SKA, for instance, in radio protected zones where there is no emission, but it's only emission on the ground. And nothing protects you from satellites. They're everywhere. So, and it's just the sheer number of satellites that suddenly appears. In the past, we could organize our observations maybe to avoid some satellites, but that won't be impossible anymore in the future.
Yeah. There's also this concern, right, that, you know, in a way, these huge numbers of satellites, which are relatively cheap, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but there's this possible danger that some of the electronics are broadcasting, leaking outside the protected frequency bands. And that's, I think, an issue which people haven't appreciated enough.
It's absolutely true. We have experienced bad experience in the past where exactly that happened, and that happened only for well-built satellite. Now we have all these cheap satellites, and we're not only talking about OneWeb or SpaceX or whatever, but also these nanocubes. They're equally cheap, and they have much more danger than the current generation of satellites. So it's really the probability that one of these satellites goes rogue, so to speak, and is polluting the protected signal spectrum. Once it's up there, it's very difficult to fix, if not impossible to fix. Then we have to live with it. It's impossible.
Right. Meredith, let's come back to the optical side, because as Michelle said, you know, it blinds you across the whole, you know, the whole sky effectively, but we're only seeing streaks of light in the visible and the infrared. You know, why can't we just stack images and get rid of them? I mean, is there a specific issue with the hypersensitive telescopes and detectors and electronics that we have?
Sure. So there's a couple of things there. It is possible in some situations to do, as you say, to stack the images and use algorithms to detect linear features and remove them or mask them or not use those pixels in all scientific analyses. The problem becomes that sometimes what you want to measure is actually a really faint, subtle background noise level measurements in order to do cosmology and other really important studies. And if you have, you know, kind of crisscross spaghetti stripes all over your background, then you're not going to be able to do those studies. You're not going to be able to figure out how fast the universe is expanding, or, you know, the fate of our universe is this kind of study you won't be able to do in that situation with that data set. The other issue that you get into is that that's not the only kind of science you want to do, right? Sometimes you're going to miss things, like Sam was saying earlier, right? If you're trying to find a supernova and it happens to be behind a satellite streak, you're out of luck. So,
yeah, and there's also this issue with the electronics saturating to the point where there's a bleed over from one detector into another if the satellites are really bright. And some of these near Earth, you know, these LEO satellites that only have 350 kilometers high, they're really bright, right?
That's true. Yeah. So saturation can be a concern. What we've seen with some of the Starlink satellites specifically so far is that, at least for Rubin Observatory, is what I'm most familiar with. Well, we don't have data from Rubin Observatory yet, but precursor surveys like the Dark Energy Camera, they're similar. We don't see saturation as a main problem for the satellites that are already up at their final operational orbits. Those are still not as faint as we would like them to be, but they're not bright enough that they will saturate the detector. Instead, you get more subtle effects, like you can get a nonlinear electronic crosstalk effect that is hard to correct for perfectly. So, and again, this is the kind of thing that can lead to systematic biases kind of creeping into your data analysis.
So it's not only ground-based telescopes, of course, but space-based telescopes get to see these trails. And in fact, they get to see them in weird ways because Hubble is close enough to some of the orbits of these satellites that the streaks are actually out of focus. The objects are so wide, they cover huge amounts of the detector real estate. But a thing that's often said, Michael, let me bring it to you, because it is that we should just move all astronomy into space, that we should get above the low Earth orbit and go and put telescopes on the far side of the moon. Some of our telescopes, of course, are millions of kilometers away, like the Gaia mission. But that, that's not entirely practical, is it?
And it's not practical for radio astronomy, where we need really big apertures to collect all the photons. They're low energy photons, so you need to collect a lot of them. And so the biggest telescope will have a collecting area of a square kilometer, and try to build that in space. So yes, the moon is probably the only protected side, the backside of the moon in the whole solar system. And whether this is cheap, I doubt it. And it's very difficult to get the data back. So you may have satellites around the moon to bring the data back. So that defeats the purpose. So it's not practical at all, I would say.
Yeah. And the Chinese are now building a new space telescope in low Earth orbit as well. It's not as if everything's going to L2 or further away. Exactly. So the last question before we take questions from the panelists. Sam, what are amateur astronomers doing in the crossover to professional astronomy, which is important?
I mean, astrophotography is strongly affected by the same reasons, right? You point a telescope at a spot on the sky and many satellites fly through in that period of time. Just stargazing is affected by this, right? Just going outside and, so I live in rural Saskatchewan. This is the first place I've ever lived where I can walk out my back door and see the Milky Way at night. And it's incredible. I so appreciate that. But I have noticed, even just in the last year, more satellites, right? So it is noticeable to the naked eye. It is very noticeable with a small telescope, and it is, incredibly almost destructive with a large telescope.
Great. Well, thanks all three. We're open now to questions, Andy.
So I'll just read some interesting things out that I've seen. So I'll go straight to one from the public on YouTube. Somebody's asked me something a lot of people come up with. SpaceX did this experiment of plating satellites black. So doesn't that just take care of the problem? We just make them dark.
They tried that with one satellite. Sorry if it's okay for me to jump in. It was called DarkSat, interestingly enough. And it made it a little darker, but not dark enough. There's a whole study that I helped with to measure the brightness of that satellite relative to other ones. And it turns out that it also wasn't a viable solution for SpaceX because the satellite got too hot, and then it wasn't able to operate as well as it should. So they switched. Yeah, so they switched to trying a visor to kind of reflect the sunlight. And it's really great that they've been willing to work with astronomers to try these different technical mitigations. It's conceivable that some other company could say, we don't care about astronomy at all. We're going to launch lots of bright things no matter what. Too bad for you. And so it's really been good that the engineers at SpaceX have been willing to cooperate with astronomers and collaborate to try to mitigate the brightness. We're not at a place yet that I would say they have fully succeeded in coming up with a technical mitigation that will make it dim enough, especially when the satellites are being launched. There's like a couple weeks where they're still getting up to their final orbits. That is a whole other situation that still needs to kind of be addressed.
I'll add one thing to that myself, that the SpaceX people have been accommodating. They've tried, but in the future, if there's just, Chinese companies, Russian companies, random people from Brazil we've never heard of, we don't know what they're going to do. Stuart Eves had a good question, which is that even if we manage to limit the satellite's optical and radio frequency brightness, is it still a problem for infrared astronomy?
Yeah, let me talk to that. This is obviously an issue, and Meredith touched on it, right? Photons go in, photons have to come out, right? I mean, they either get absorbed and re-emitted at longer wavelengths, and the NEO-WISE satellite has been seeing satellite trails in space as well. I haven't looked specifically at ground-based infrared observations to see if they're having a problem, but broadly speaking, in the near infrared out to 2 microns, they're going to be just similarly affected. We are beginning to see some color differences. So we are actually seeing with Hubble that you're seeing brighter trails in the infrared wavelengths, optical infrared, let's say. So it doesn't help. You're still going to get hurt in the infrared.
Catherine's asked, as well as the space question, which you addressed, Mark, already, do you see people saying, well, why don't you just send telescopes to the moon?
Yeah, well, the moon's an absolutely horrendous place to do things, and we're struggling at the moment to try and work out how we put humans back there. I mean, dust is a major problem, and on the moon, it's really nasty kind of dust. It's not rounded pebbles like on a small scale dust is on the Earth. It's incredibly sharp, nasty stuff, and it cuts through electronics cables, gets in suits, it gets all over mirrors. But it's, vastly expensive, and this debate keeps coming up. Well, the billionaires will just pay for you to build all your telescopes in space from the proceeds of their satellite constellation. And I think, that's not the world I live in. So I'm not really sure that I trust that kind of benevolence is going to be something that we expect to. And, our telescopes are built by the taxpayer. And so this is a taxpayer issue, right? What do you want to see in your balance overall? It wouldn't be our decision alone to say, yeah, move everything into space, but it's going to cost you 50 times as much.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's taxpayers' dollars.
I like to think euros, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I know it's just a familiar phrase. That's right. It annoys the Canadians as well as the Dutch. So I think I was thinking of commenting. We should move on in a second, but if we're being honest with the world, I think we shouldn't give the impression that it's destroying the sky right now. It's not that bad. It's already annoying for amateurs and professionals, but it's not that bad. It's a question of where the hell is this going to stop? We have no way to understand how bad it's going to get. And I know that Sam and Aaron and Stefano as well worked very hard on making predictions for where this might go. So for me, that's the big thing. And we must be careful not to overplay how awful it is now, because it isn't yet. But we know it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Kern Kaiken online is asking, is Earth observation from satellites also affected badly?
There are some frequencies where it is. For example, if you want to measure water in the upper atmosphere looking down with your satellites, you get radio interference, and that can definitely pollute some of the observations. It tends not to be an issue, of course, for satellites taking images of the ground. But it's when you're using radio frequencies, that's when it can become a problem for Earth observation. And we have satellites that do that.